When one thinks of Mount Airy, North Carolina, one usually thinks of Mayberry and Andy Griffith. But Mount Airy and Surry County were also the adopted homes of two amazing conjoined twins, perhaps two of the most famous people of the 19th century, Eng and Cheng Bunker. Each year for the past 24 years, members of their extended families have gathered together each July for a family reunion and to celebrate their unique heritage. Coming from near and far, these relatives are all descended from Eng and Cheng, two men from whom the term Siamese twins was invented.
Eng and Cheng, the first Siamese twins in the world, and they came here about almost 200 years ago. So that's really play an important part in strengthening our relations, to let people know about Thailand. At the time, the name is Siam. So that's one of the beginning of the history of our relations.
As you wander from group to group and listen to the different speakers at the reunion, you start to get a sense of how truly amazing the story of Eng and Cheng really is. Without a doubt, they were the rock stars of their time and place, traveling the world, meeting kings and queens and all sorts of interesting people, before choosing to settle down first in Wilkes County and then later Surry County, North Carolina. But to fully understand their journey, you have to go back to where it all began, Siam, or as it is known today, Thailand.
Well, they were born in 1811, very, very poor. Their family lived on a riverboat. They were born on a bamboo mat, and they were number 5 and 6 of 9 children. When they were first born, the way they were born, they were turned so that each one's head came between the other's legs, and the mother did not even realize she had delivered twins. At the time, she just thought it was sort of a large baby. But then when they realized that they were conjoined, the two midwives that were on the boat to help left screaming because of Buddhism being the superstitions and a bad omen, that something bad, even maybe the end of time was coming or something drastic was going to happen to their country. In the meantime, the father had taken the two of the older children, and left the boat during the delivery. And the mother ended up having to take care of the children immediately, and she already had them bathed and fed and asleep when the father came with the other children back home. Again, it was very ordinary for any time there was anything of a freak of nature in birth that the king would have the babies killed. And so she was very, very afraid of that. So they were kept hid for almost 2 years. And the word was finally out about them. And the king finally saw them. And when he saw them, he was very fascinated with them and decided to not kill them. And in time, when they were probably 15 years old, he was using them as diplomats to travel with him to go to some of the other countries just for a goodwill ambassador. When they were 8 years old, I believe it was 8, their father, there was some very, very bad disease came through swept the countryside, and 5 of their siblings and their father all died within a 2-week period. And there was so many people in the community dying, there was not a place to bury everybody, so they threw the children in the canal. And it was very traditional by Buddhism for the father to be cremated. And the mother took all of her savings to have that done, and the twins had to witness at age 8 their father being cremated, which put a scar on them for life. And then, of course, the mother had spent all her money, so there's no income. So the twins start work at 8 years old. They find out that duck and duck eggs are very, very much in demand. So what little money they get, they buy ducks and raise them for the eggs, and they start selling eggs and built quite a business right on through their teen years and giving all the money to their mother. And sometimes when they would be up and down the river, they might find some other merchants that they could buy some typical general merchandise, that they could sell and make a little bit of profit, and in turn give that to their mother. And so that's pretty much how they were brought up.
With the boys' strong desire to act as normal boys and the need for them to help their families survive, they began venturing further and further from their houseboat. They were determined not to be held back by their physical deformity. Highly intelligent, they learned to anticipate and coordinate their physical movements and even learned to swim in tandem. As a result of their increasing activity and visibility to the outside world, more and more people began to hear about them. Their reputation as oddities was spreading, and everybody wanted to see the amazing things they could do.
The tourists in the area were already hearing about them and gathering at the riverbanks, hoping to even get a glimpse of them going about their daily lives. And then when they were probably about 15 years old, there was a sea merchant from New York City that was just there walking down by the canal one day, and he sees all these arms and legs flying through the water swimming, and honestly thought it was a monster of some sort. It scared him enough that he stepped back till he saw they stopped and got out of the water, till he saw that it was actually two human beings conjoined. Of course, he immediately started seeing dollar bills back in America, freak shows, and even went home with them and made friends with our mother and started the deal of trying to get them out of the country, to come to America to travel in freak shows. Well, it so happened the king would not let them leave the country till they were 18 years old. So, but he maintained every time he would go to the area to buy merchandise to bring back to New York to sell, he would always stop by to see the mother and see the twins and kept contact. And finally, on their 18th birthday, they left, they boarded a ship to come to America with the sea merchants into the Boston area.
During the voyage to Boston, the boys picked up a very rough grasp of the English language. One can only imagine, however, the extreme culture shock they must have experienced upon stepping off their ship into 1829 Boston. It had to seem like a completely alien land, and to a large extent it was. Yet they were not deterred. They were anxious to learn new things and more than ready to go to work, and work they did, but unfortunately for the benefit of others.
Then the sea merchant turned the management over to the wife, who was a very strict, ran, as we say, a tight ship. And she wanted the boys displayed 7 days a week. They traveled in a carriage and a horse, and she in turn hired a local person to be their manager, and seemed like that even if they requested money for a repair on the carriage, she didn't want to pay. She didn't want to pay to have extra clothes. She wanted the money coming to her and really paying them very, very little.
Crisscrossing the young United States, Eng and Cheng traveled from Vermont to Louisiana and back again, performing for overflow crowds. Often billed as the eighth wonder of the world, they were wildly popular attractions. Nobody had ever seen anything like them.
Well, sometimes at some of the shows, starting out, their admission was as little as 10 cents. And then it later worked on up to around 25 cents. And then after they went out on their own, sometimes wherever they went, they would supply their own tents, which would be a huge tent. But they started out basically coming out and sitting on the stage and letting the people look at them and ask questions and that type of thing. Well, the twins themselves were very bored with that. They wanted to be a little bit active, to let the people know we can do some things. So they started some things such as doing some somersaults and cartwheels and some of that type of thing. And then they were strong guys, and sometimes they would ask for the largest person in the audience to come to show they could pick them up. And those, just anything they could create to put some life into the show. And of course, with experience, they thought of this and thought of this and thought of this right on down the line. And then it got to be quite a little production. And this went on for quite some time. And the boys learned by their 21st birthday, being as intelligent as they were, and being forced to learn English at a very, very rapid pace, that in this country, they could declare their own independence and totally set themselves free from those sea merchants on their 21st birthday.
And so they did. Feeling exploited and demeaned by Susan Coffin, the twins had grown increasingly irritated with life on the road, where they had been forced to suffer poor traveling conditions and constant overwork without seeing any of the fruits of their labors. With the help of their traveling manager, Charles Harris, they hatched a plan to declare their freedom from Susan Coffin on their 21st birthday and go into business for themselves.
Her husband had turned everything over to her, where she wrote him, and of course he was back in Thailand, traveling back and forth buying merchandise for the ship to bring back in to sell in the New York, Boston area. And he tried to be the big bully with the convincing, that you promised this and you promised this and it's going to be this way. But they endured and finally totally got rid of them. But Charles Harris was a great, great person, and I think I told you he ended up being my great-great-grandfather.
Following their emancipation from the Coffins, Eng and Cheng continued to perform and travel all around the country, including trips to Cuba and Canada. The important difference now, however, was they got to keep what they earned. In 1835, along with their manager and friend, Charles Harris, they embarked on a very successful tour of Europe, where they performed for kings and queens and a wide assortment of aristocrats.
And after 10 years of their travel, they were back in New York City at the exhibiting at the Barnum Museum. Well, that's when this medical doctor from Wilkesboro, who was Dr. James Calloway, just happened to be in New York on business and had a free afternoon and sort of wandered into the museum, not having any idea what was there. Went into the room where the twins were and instantly totally gratified by just their appearance, what they had to say. They became instant friends. In time, they exchanged addresses, and through correspondence and through Charles Harris, the doctor invited them to come to Wilkesboro strictly for a vacation, not an exhibit. They came, they fell in love with the countryside, and they never wanted to leave. They said it was so much like their home country of Thailand. Once they all decided, and Charles Harris was equally as impressed with Wilkes County as the twins were. So they went out into, once they decided to stay, they went out into what ended up being the Trap Hill community and found this Robert Bogus that had this big house with two vacant rooms in it, looking for just a temporary quarters till they could really decide what they were going to do. And Charles Harris rented one room and the twins rented the other one. The twins were liking the area so well, they had gone ahead and bought property from Robert Bogus to settle in the neighborhood and had already built their house. They had to have special furniture built, chairs for two, various pieces of furniture to accommodate the two, and in anticipation of getting married at some point, they decided to go ahead and get what they called a double bed built. I guess they hadn't heard of the California king size at that point.
Part of their new lives in Wilkes County centered around their increasing desire to get married and start families, something no set of conjoined twins in history had ever done. They soon met the girls who would later become their wives, interestingly enough, at the wedding of their good friend and former manager, Charles Harris.
After the wedding, everybody was to bring a covered dish, and if they had a stringed instrument of any kind, to bring that so they could dance the evening away, And it so happened these two Yates girls who lived on the outskirts of the neighborhood showed up at the wedding, which was the first time the twins had ever seen them. And they kept noticing each other throughout the afternoon. And finally, after I guess not being able to stand it any longer, Eng and Cheng walked over to them, and Eng looked at the girls and said, "My brother would like to get married today," said, "Do you know anybody that might be available?" And of course, that was what broke the ice for the entire lifetime of together. In time, both men fell for the same girl, which was Adelaide. Cheng finally won her over. But it took about 2 years then for Cheng and Adelaide to really get Sarah and Eng interested in each other enough to where they all got married on the same date. And they spent their wedding night on that double bed and shared it the first 2 years of their married life. 4 babies came along. And in the meantime, the twins owned a little general merchandise store in the neighborhood. But again, there was so few people that lived there to shop there. There wasn't much income. And they had spent most of their travel money on the land, the furnishings, the house, those types of things. Since all of a sudden here 2 years later, there's 8 mouths to feed in that family. So they decided that, had visited Mount Airy, and they realized for some reason in the early 1840s that there was a lot more people settling in this area. So they came over and looked the situation over, and they found property, bought it, built a house, built their store, moved over here, sold everything over in Trap Hill, and lived in one house, which they lived there for 12 years. 9 more babies came along. Well, that brings the number up to 17 living in the house. Then they bring in 3 house servants to help with the work, just the general housework and the children. Well, at this point, the sisters are starting to totally become disgruntled with each other. The house is entirely too crowded. So the men realize there's a big problem, and at that point, they have a meeting with the twins and their wives, and they decide at that time that it's time to totally divide the farm and build a second house. And that's when they actually did the situation. And they built the second house, ended up being about a half a mile from the first house, but still on the farm. And that house is still standing today, and it was built in the 1850s. And some descendants live in it today. As soon as that was finished, which ended up being Cheng and Adelaide agreeing there, and they moved to that house. But they, in the division of the farm, to get the acreage and dividing the slaves, they divided everything. Eng ended up with less land but more slaves in the settlement.
Now, having separate houses and separate families, Eng and Cheng were faced with the perplexing question of how to divide their time between the 2 different households.
Twins suddenly realize, we've got to get in on this plan too. So that's when it's decided that it's 3 days and nights with this family and 3 days and nights with this family. And they did that without exception, until they died at age 63 and 21 babies later. And they were so intimate or so involved with keeping this that one time on the 3rd day, it was time to leave Eng's house. And Eng's had a baby to die that day, but they still left the house. The wife had to take care and bury the baby while they were at the other house. They did it without exception all the way through.
After dividing their farms and settling into a strict routine, Eng and Cheng began to prosper and became respected members of their community.
When the people really saw these men were good neighbors, they were just human beings like everybody else in the neighborhood. They wanted to fit into the neighborhood, and they were very warm personality-wise and very acceptable. And even after they came here, you don't ever find any documentation of anything dealing with their race or deformity that helped them back in the least. In fact, a lot of the local people would come to them asking for advice just on various things, both with the farming once they got their farms up and going, and they were go-getters. They introduced tobacco to Northwest North Carolina. They called it the golden leaf. And they even invented a press to make plug chewing tobacco long before R.J. Reynolds thought of it. And they taught their slaves how to make the plug tobacco, and they would go on the road and sell it. But it would seem like just They had all of these animals, all of these grain crops. It seemed like almost anything they touched turned to gold.
Life for the twins was not without its hiccups. Like many other Southerners, the Civil War bankrupted them when their Confederate money became worthless. In response, the two brothers went back on tour to raise some much-needed cash. Wanting to maximize their star power and potential earnings, they planned on going to countries where they had never traveled, such as Germany and Russia, where they would meet the Tsar. They were also supposed to travel to Austria, but war intervened and they decided to head home. On their return journey while crossing the Atlantic, Cheng had a stroke and suffered a partial paralysis. Although he recovered, his health would never be the same and the end was not far away.
And then at the very end, which was a very, very cold, blizzard, snowy day in January, it was time to change houses. And Cheng had pneumonia. And both wives and Eng begged him to stay, for them to stay at Cheng's house, And he said, under no conditions, he says, we have never broken this tradition, and we're not going to start today. Well, even though the houses were only about a half a mile apart the way the crow flies, it was about a mile and a half the way the little buggy went, and it was an open buggy, a carriage and a horse, and they went like 3:30 in the afternoon, and of course Sarah knew that it was cold and knew that they were sick, or that Cheng was sick. So she had extra logs on the fire, and everything, because they got chilled coming over, and had plenty of heat and plenty of hot food for them, to get them warmed up real fast. But anyway, about 5:30 to the next morning, Cheng died. And there had always been a promise from a Dr. Hollingsworth that if that type of thing ever happened, he would attempt a separation if he could get there in time. So by the time Sarah got the oldest son up, got to the stable, saddled the horse, rode 4 miles through that snow and ice into town, get the doctor, get his horse saddled, ride back 4 miles, the time had already lapsed and Eng had died.
Following the twins' deaths, the wives decided not to have a public funeral and burial. They were scared that a grave robber would try to dig the twins up and profit from it. Indeed, offers to buy the bodies started quickly coming in, ranging from hundreds of dollars to thousands of dollars. The wives were horrified. To protect their husbands, the wives made the decision to bury the twins in the privacy of their basement so that no one could ever disturb them. Shortly after the twins' death, a doctor from Philadelphia traveled to Mount Airy to inquire about doing a medical autopsy on the twins for the advancement of medicine. After 2 days of intensive arguing, the doctor successfully convinced the wives. The twins' coffin was dug up, and the bodies were shipped to Philadelphia for the autopsy. After several months, the bodies were returned to Mount Airy, minus several internal organs. The conjoined liver of the twins is still in Philadelphia, where it is currently on display at the Mutter Museum.
Well, anyway, when they brought them back, they returned them to that same grave under Eng's house, which again was the second barrel. And they were there for about 2 years. And for a reason that we have never been able to learn in research, they were moved to the second house outside under a holly tree under the living room window. And they were there for 42 years before they were taken to a cemetery. That would have been their third burial. And during that 42 years, that house was never left vacant by a widow, a child, or a grandchild, again, to be sure that those bodies were never bothered.
After the final widow died, Cheng and En's oldest sons decided it was time to move their father's remains to the cemetery at White Plains Baptist Church, where they still reside today. This final interment constituted the 4th time the twins had been buried.
So they employed 2 men to exhume their bodies. They had them to open the coffin to be sure the bodies had deteriorated enough they could never be used for profit. And they had 2 teams of horses and wagons. They put the twins on one, Adelaide on the other, and when they left, the horses just started motion. At that point, just out of the clear blue sky, a dove landed on top of Eng and Cheng's coffin. And it was about 1.5 miles to the cemetery, the way the little cricket road went at that time. The dove sat there the entire trip to the cemetery. And when they unloaded the body to go over the grave, the dove did not fly. It sat right there till it got to the grave, and until they started to lower the coffin into the ground, then the dove flew away.
The legacy of Cheng and Eng is as varied as it is extensive. From a small village in Thailand to the grandest European halls, they traveled the world performing for king and commoner alike. Settling in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, they raised large families and developed extensive land holdings totaling nearly 1,000 acres. Marketed worldwide as freaks of nature, these extraordinary brothers craved normalcy and sought at the end to live their lives doing all the things that normal people do, living, loving, educating their children, and being fiercely independent.